see you guys in the dark.
Back in August, I was hospitalized in the voluntary psychiatric ward at the nearby hospital due to some major anxiety and depression issues. It was unfortunately my second hospitalization, and at this time they only had room for me in a room with a roommate. No one knows why, but for some reason, when the psychiatric ward was built, they decided to put in rooms with roommates. Because of this, usually only high functioning people are put into double rooms. So I show up, nurses all remember me, but most of the patients are different. Because it's the voluntary unit, there's no actively psychotic or violent people. My roommate, Jane, seemed nice though. She was a quiet, plain, petite woman. One thing she really liked to do was sit and work on crossword puzzles. In the rooms, each patient gets a desk and dresser, and our dressers were right next to each other. Each room also has a very beautiful photograph in them that was obviously not behind glass. I was admitted to the hospital around 6 p.m. At 9:30, I had taken my medication and was medicated before going to sleep. I was looking at this beautiful picture of a tree and a fence at sunset, and I was focusing on it while slowing my breathing. Then I noticed that there was writing on it. I hadn't noticed the writing earlier. It was in pencil and was put into the picture with enough force to indent it. The writing said, "They are liars, fucking liars," and some other things that I couldn't make out. It weirded me out a bit, but I figured it had been there before, and it had been a previous patient. I went to the nurse's station and I let them know about it. If you've ever been in a psychiatric unit, you'll know it's terribly boring. I spent most days walking around the unit, painting the art room or in groups. I began to notice that my roommate never went to any of these groups. In fact, she never left the room. Then I realized that she never left her desk. Each time I came into the room, she'd be sitting at the desk working on a crossword. I figured that's how she dealt with the boredom and tried to make small talk when I came in and out of the room. Then I began to realize that the crossword wasn't changing anymore. It was the same crossword with no progress. The second night I went to go to bed around 10:30 p.m. When I woke up that day, she was sitting at her desk working on the crosswords again. When I came back to go to sleep, she was still working on crosswords with the light on. I shrugged at it because by this point, she was no longer responding to me, saying hi, or asking how I was doing in groups. I figured she might be having a medication reaction or just not feeling like talking, so I turned off all of my lights and pulled the curtains that separated our beds. The medication I was on at the time really knocked me out, so I was able to go fall asleep quickly. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to one of the medical assistants or nurses asking my roommate if she thought it was time to go to bed or turn off her light so that I could sleep. She didn't really respond to the person and didn't turn off the light. I ended up going back to sleep. At some point, she had turned off the light and gone to bed. I woke up in darkness again. I had earplugs in, and the medication I was on literally made me sleep for 12 hours straight without waking, so I was pretty confused. I realized I could hear someone talking. I took my earplugs out and realized that it was my roommate. She kept repeating, "Jesse, help me. Jesse, help me." I responded with, "Jane, are you okay? Jane, are you okay?" She did not respond to me, but stopped saying it, so I thought that she was talking in her sleep or something, and I went back to bed. I woke up again at some point, and she was saying the same thing, but louder. I knew that she wasn't talking in her sleep this time. I tried to get her to respond to me, but she never responded. She was just semi yelling, "Jesse, help me. I need help, Jesse." I got up and got the night nurse, whose name was Jessie, and I told her my roommate was calling for her. But by the time I came back into my room and the nurse came back, Jane was hysterical. She was crying out for Jessie and trying to get out of bed. Jessie did her best to calm her. I was rattled, but given the sedation I was on, I ended up going back to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, my roommate wasn't in the room, and the table that had been near her bed was in front of the bathroom curtain. No doors because of the suicide risk. I went to use the bathroom, and there was an entire roll of toilet paper in the toilet. I went and got a nurse because I didn't want to be the one in charge of flooding the bathroom. When I went out to the floor, I realized two odd things. First, there was a medical assistant sitting at the desk near the door. Second, Jane was also standing at that door. The door only opens when someone phones in, so I was confused as to why they were there. Had to be someone initially guarding the door. I found out from another patient who had insomnia that my roommate had spent the night running around the ward and throwing furniture around. They finally got security down to talk to her. She calmed down, but she stood in front of the door and was still standing there. Weird, but hey, crazy is as crazy does. I went about my usual routine of eating breakfast and painting. I asked some about the assistants about my roommate, and they tell me she's been standing there since their shift started, which was at 6 a.m. It's now 10:30 a.m. I'm a little creeped out, but just keep on painting. I do abstract watercolors, but get pretty into it. Then I notice something out of the corner of my eye. I look up, and it's Jane, outside of the room and staring at me. She sees me look up, and then she looks away, but she doesn't move for a good 20 minutes. I get weirded out and decided to go back to my room for the first time that morning. She follows me into the room. I act like I was just picking something up and then leave again and go to the assistant sitting in front of the front desk. I tell her politely that I may sound a little paranoid, but I think my roommate is following me around. She lets me sit with her in front of the desk. Because I'm sitting there with nothing to do, I decided to call my insurance company with a question. As I'm on the phone, Jane comes walking up with two plastic bins full of stuff. When you're first let into the unit, they give you a plastic bin with various toiletries. The bins are full of her stuff, and my stuff. She also has a pillowcase off of my bed that is full of my clothing. I lose it. I start yelling. Why does she have my stuff? Why does she have my iPad? Who let her do this? This iPad is worth $800. And I just start crying hysterically. When she came out of there were three nurses standing by me, and they were just flabbergasted. They never had seen anything like this. I'm on the floor crying with my eyes closed, and someone kneels down next to me, puts their arm around me, and says to me, It's going to be okay. You're going to be okay. I assume that it's a nurse, so I open up my eyes. It's Jane. I tell her to stop touching me, and tell the nurses that I want her away from me right now. The nurses end up bringing me into a private meeting room to go through my stuff, and tell me that Jane is going to be transferred to the involuntary ward at some point during the day. Unfortunately, due to Jane's behavior, my stuff cannot be put back into my room, and I'm essentially left without a room for most of the day. While this has been going on, Jane has not moved to the back, which opens up into a stairwell that you go down to get to the garden outside. There's no way for her to open it, obviously. She stands there for hours, and I mean hours. After a while, I would just start ignoring her, even though she stares at me whenever I'm in her line of vision. Around 6 or 7 p.m. at night, my husband and I are playing cards with another patient who had been moved onto our unit so that Jane could be moved upstairs. We were playing in the meal room, which is the room that Jane was waiting near. As we're playing rummy, we see the psychiatric come up and with two security guards. She's explaining to Jane that Jane has to go upstairs. Jane gets agitated and refuses to move. A security guard moves to take her arm, and she gets more agitated and starts yelling, No, no, no. When they go to grab her, she turns to the window, starts banging on it, looking straight at me, and screams at me for help. They end up dragging her, literally kicking and screaming the entire length of the unit upstairs. I was a bit shaken up, but at least she was now off the unit. I end up with another roommate, also named Jane, but she is super sweet, and in the unit because she's detoxing from some meds that she was on while in another unit in the hospital. My attending psychiatric assures me that my reaction was completely normal to someone having a psychotic break, and I start to feel more comfortable. The next day after lunch, it's garden time. I loved being able to go outside. At the time, I was only allowed 30 minutes with a capable adult. The unit is pretty deep into the hospital, so it would give me and my husband about 10 minutes outside, whereas garden time is 30 minutes. I'm excited, and then see that Jane is one of the people coming on the garden time from upstairs. I'm nervous, so I ask the assistants coming out to supervise me if they can, so that I can sit near them during garden time. They assure me that it is fine and everything goes okay. Jane doesn't approach me at all, but when we come back in, I made sure to break off from the group and get away from Jane as soon as possible, instead of following the assistants and the security guards. Back down the hallway to the front door of the unit, she makes a beeline to my room. I didn't see her again after that, so I think her condition may have deteriorated more, or they have realized that having her be able to have access to me or my things was a bad idea. As I know earlier today, when I was at lunch with a friend, I thought I saw her in a car and almost freaked out. The poor lady getting out of the car was so confused as to why I was looking at her with such a look of fear on my face. This didn't happen to me. It actually happened to my very good friend. We'll call him Dan. Dan is 5'10", male, from Maryland. He has a very strange sense of humor, and he's very smart, but an all-out good guy. Anyways, we go to the same university. Dan moved into his dorm room before his roommate did. Dan had everything all moved in and settled. Just as he sat down, his roommate had showed up to move everything in. His roommate, we'll call Brian, introduced himself and his mother, his father, who was also trying to help him move, which, like any other person, Dan decided to help his new roommate move everything in since he didn't know anyone yet, as he was from a different state. So Dan and Brian's family got down to their car as Brian stayed behind to the room to put things away. This is the first red flag in this story. As they open up the trunk, Brian's father looks at Dan directly in the face and says, "Good luck." Dan, thinking he meant with classes, said thanks and grabbed a box. He was really wrong about that. Dan carried that box upstairs, went into the room where Brian proceeded to flip out. He screamed about how that box had his special ingredients for a project he was doing, and Dan had probably broke it. Weird, but everyone has their quirks. They finished moving Brian in, and his parents said goodbye. And again, Brian's dad told Dan good luck, which was really weird. But anyways, a couple of guys came by to the door to ask if they wanted to go eat. Dan said sure, but Brian had stayed behind to finish unpacking his stuff. While Dan was eating, he gets a call from Brian asking if he would mind if he smoked weed in the room. Dan, being that he wants to work for the CDC, said absolutely not. Brian screamed something unintelligible and hung up on the phone. He called him back a few minutes later and asked if he could smoke weed in the closet. Again, Dan said no. Brian hung up without a word, and Dan and his friends decided to go make sure he wasn't really smoking weed in the room. When they got there, they found him in the closet eating the weed. Weird as hell, right? Not even close to as bad as this gets. At night, Brian would wake up Dan by standing beside his bed, then asked him one question. Dan would answer, and Brian would walk back to his bed and then go to sleep. This happened every night for a week. At this point, Brian had moved in an entire toolbox full of wrenches, screwdrivers, hammers, nails, screws, and an assortment of power tools, things that weren't needed in a dorm room. During this entire week, Brian never left the room. The only time he left was to eat and go to the bathroom. About 4 days before the week where the dorm rooms would change, Brian woke Dan up in the middle of the night and asked him how he felt about gay people. Dan said he didn't really care about anyone and what they did. It was fine with him. Dan woke up the next morning with Brian sitting in a chair directly by his bed, staring at him. Dan instinctively yelled, "What the fuck are you doing?" Brian then replied, "I'm starting to have feelings for you. You need to move out. I don't want you getting hurt during what is coming." After that, Dan left and didn't sleep in his room for a couple of days until he could move. Unfortunately, there were no open rooms, so he couldn't move at all. During this time, Brian started to follow Dan around. Brian would sleep in the closet with his tools making something. Dan eventually convinced the head of the dorm to let him move into a now empty room next door after 3 weeks in what describes as hell. Dan moved to the room next door. No big deal, right? Nah. 2 days later, Dan gets a knock at the door at 9 a.m., thinking that it was the guys that on his floor that he had become friends with, who just might be screwing with him. He screams, "What the fuck do you want?" and answers the door in his boxers. At the door was 4 state police troopers in full hazmat gear. The trooper in front said, "Not who you were expecting, huh?" So at least someone had a sense of humor. They let Dan put some clothes on, then let him out the door. At the end of the hallway was Brian in handcuffs. Turns out Brian had been building pipe bombs and other bombs in the dorm room while Dan was at class. After Dan had moved out, he took over the other bed and closet for his bomb making activities. The reason the hazmat team was there was because Brian had spilled liquid mercury all over the floor, and they were afraid that it had gotten into the other rooms. When they went through all of Brian's things, they found a plan that it had also had guns hidden all around the city. This kid had planned a massive attack, but he had written Dan's name down with a heart around it and wrote "Do not kill." Brian is obviously in prison now.
If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell for notifications on future videos, and become a stalker of the night. And I'll see you next time.